I don't really read a lot of online tech journalism, especially articles about desktop Linux, because for me, those are infuriating to read. The articles that people write about desktop Linux, most of them are really fluff kind of content. They don't have any real substance. A lot of them seem like they were written by AI most of the time. And then the ones that are actual articles written by a human being, sometimes they're not written by anybody that's knowledgeable at all about Linux. And one that I came across the other day, I wanted to share with you guys, is this article on Make Use Of. Sorry, Linux fans, this OS is actually the better Windows replacement. And then we see the screenshot here. He's showing a MacBook. Now, normally, again, I don't read these kinds of articles, but when I saw the headline, I had to read this thing because there's no way any serious tech journalist could suggest that macOS is a better Windows replacement than Linux. Like, I can't imagine a scenario where I would ever recommend somebody move from Windows to Mac. What's the play there? So reading along with the article here, he makes 4 main points of why he thinks Mac OS is the true alternative to Windows. Like, if you want to replace Windows with something, your only option is Mac OS. And the first one he talks about here is app support. He says app support is miles better on Mac OS. And this one kind of makes my brain hurt a little bit. Like, this is so subjective to the person. There are certain applications that are available on macOS that are not available on Linux. Guess what? There's also applications that are available on Linux that aren't available on macOS. And we could say the same thing about Windows as well. This will be depending on the person and the software they're required to use. Yeah, there's going to be software that's not available on all these operating systems. So when he says app support is miles better on macOS, he's really talking about, well, in the article, he talks about 2 things that he has to use. He has to use Microsoft Office and the Adobe Creative Suite, which are not available on Linux. Now, technically speaking, I mean, you could use Office 365 on Linux, so you could use the cloud-based, Microsoft Office 365. But if you need the actual desktop client, yeah, it doesn't run natively on Linux. The Adobe Creative Cloud Suite doesn't work at all on Linux. But then again, if you're somebody that is using Linux primarily as your desktop operating system, like me, been using it nearly 20 years exclusively, I don't know anything about Microsoft Office or these Adobe programs because they were never available to me anyway. I've grown used to using things like LibreOffice, which he does mention in this article that, Microsoft Office doesn't work on Linux, but, there is LibreOffice, and for editor, there is DaVinci Resolve works on Linux, but he mentions that's not what he needs. He needs these other products. And, again, it's all about, hey, the stuff I really needed doesn't work on Linux, so therefore Linux sucks and Mac OS is better. And I think as a journalist, you gotta take things in a broader perspective. It can't all be about you. Now, one thing he does mention, although he says app support is miles better on Mac OS than Linux, he does admit that Linux is a million times better at gaming than Mac OS, which obviously anybody with a functional brain already knew that, but I'm glad he pointed that out. But I guess he doesn't game, so it doesn't count, right? Like, if he was a hardcore gamer, he probably would have said, well, Linux is miles better than, Mac OS. But, for him, it's all about, hey, I need Microsoft Office to work, so I've got to use Mac OS. Well, at that point, why not just stick to Windows? Why are you replacing Windows if you're so dependent on some of this Microsoft software? I mean, I don't understand the move. It's a strange move. Some other points he makes. Now, this one's a pretty fair one. Linux still has a huge learning curve, and he mentions that the terminal is still a necessity on Linux. Well, it's not necessarily a necessity. It's there. There are millions of people that use desktop Linux that never ever use the terminal. There are many distributions like Ubuntu. He's showing a screenshot of Linux Mint, other, rather user-friendly desktop Linux distributions would include things like MX Linux, Zorin, and there's a lot of really user-friendly Linux distributions that have a large user base, and most of their users are not techies. They're not geeks. They're not programmers, and they don't live in the terminal, right? So when he says the terminal is still a necessity, not really, because I've put hundreds of people on Linux over the years, as far as just normal people that are not interested in learning anything about the fundamental operating system, and they never use the terminal, right? So I think that's almost a troll job, like that's one of the things that like Windows fanboys and Mac fanboys often talk about Linux is, oh, it's so hard, you have to live in a terminal. And maybe that was the case 25 years ago. Not the case now. Probably the worst point he makes in this article is this one here, though. Hardware support can be very hit or miss. And he's talking about with Linux, not with macOS. And this makes my brain hurt a little bit because macOS doesn't have nearly the hardware support that Linux has. The Linux kernel is millions and millions and millions of lines of code, and that's because of all the device drivers baked into that thing. Linux can run on practically every computing device known to man, from laptops and desktops and servers, IoT devices. It's running on the microwave in my kitchen, right? Linux runs on everything. It runs on clock radios. It runs on cars, car stereo systems and things like that. Linux runs on everything. Mac OS is not even in the same league as Linux. As far as the Linux kernel, Mac OS is designed specifically to run on Mac hardware. You have to run Mac OS on Mac hardware, which is extremely limiting. Now, in this article, he mentions he had a problem when he was trying Linux because he had a SSD drive that, when he wiped out whatever was on the computer, probably Windows, he installed Linux on it, rebooted the machine, his SSD wouldn't boot. And, he blames this on Linux. This is, depending on what his problem here was, he probably had to go in the BIOS and, enable or disable secure boot or something like that. Or you had to turn on a specific flag with the grub bootloader or whatever it happens to be. These problems these are not crazy hard problems to solve. And he mentions it wasn't a crazy problem to solve. But he mentions that he shouldn't have to do that. Well, this is not a Linux problem. This is, I had to install an operating system on a device. If he had to install Windows on that device, he may have had similar issues or different issues. If he had to install Mac OS himself on a device, he would have similar issues. This is not a Linux versus Mac OS problem. This is, I had to install the operating system problem. And, for Linux, most of the time when you're running Linux, you do install the operating system yourself. And that is his number one point, is most people don't want to install another operating system. So, this is a fair point. 99% of the people that run Linux install it themselves, right? You buy a machine from Best Buy, some cheap laptop that's already pre-installed with Windows. You're not going to run Windows on it. You just wipe it out and install, whatever it is you're going to use, Ubuntu, Debian, Arch Linux, whatever. Pick your favorite Linux distribution, and that's the one you're going to put on it. So yeah, he's right. Most of us do install our own OS. Now, if you're somebody that is scared of installing your own operating system, there are companies that do sell equipment with Linux pre-installed. There's actually several of them out there. Now, it's obviously not as prevalent as going and getting a machine that's already running Windows or Mac OS, but if you look for it, you'll find them. So while I think his point, here that most people don't want to install their OS, I think it's a fair point. I also think, again, it lacks a little bit of perspective. And I found this article kind of frustrating to read because, occasionally he would hit a point that I do think is a fair point, but he did it kind of in a trollish way. Even the headline of the article, it's obvious this is clickbait, right? He knows all of us Linux fanboys are going to be pissed off by this headline. Sorry, Linux fans, this OS is actually the better Windows replacement. And then he shows the picture of the damn MacBook, right? He knew I was going to get triggered by that. Now, my biggest issue with this article is not the points he made. It's actually a point he didn't make. He's mentioning he wants to move from Windows, replace Windows, get Windows out of his life. And he's looking for a better alternative, right? He's looking for hopefully free and open source software. Like if you're wanting to leave Windows because of all the Microsoft shenanigans and the data mining, the spyware, and the ads in the operating system, and the crazy updates that sometimes brick people's machines, and if you just want to leave all of that behind, why are you going to another proprietary operating system, one that in many ways is much more locked down than even Windows? It's just a strange move. Like if you want actual freedom, digital freedom, you want freedom with your software, with your operating system, Linux is really the only move. It's the only move that makes sense. It does not make sense. Like if this is a half-assed move, moving from Windows to Mac OS, right? If you're going to make the move all the way, right? And that's Windows to Linux. Anyway, that's food for thought. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments down below. Peace, guys.